But first, White House officials are doing everything they can to avert a railroad strike before Friday's deadline. It would be a blow to the U.S. economy when it doesn't need it. The backdrop for negotiations are the latest inflation numbers from the Labor Department. Consumer prices are still stubbornly high, something we don't need to tell you if you've bought pretty much anything other than gas lately. CBS News chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes spoke exclusively with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen about those issues and more.
Inflation remains a problem. It obviously is of tremendous concern to Americans.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen cited rising costs for rent and groceries as two of the biggest concerns.
We hope to see substantial improvement over the coming year.
Do you think inflation is close to peaking?
I don't want to get involved in month-by-month forecasts. I do believe it'll come down over time due to the actions the Fed is taking.
As she spoke, her colleagues in the cabinet worked to head off a strike by freight rail workers. With the deadline now 2 days away, some chemical shipments have already been halted. And Amtrak announced it's canceling all long-distance trains starting tomorrow because some of them use freight rail tracks.
What impact would a rail strike have on already high inflation in this country?
Well, it would be a significant impediment to shipping goods. It's certainly something we don't want to see happen.
Secretary Yellen recently worked with European allies to impose a new price cap on Russian oil. But already, energy bills in some parts of Europe are 5 times higher than usual.
What would a recession in Europe mean for the U.S. economy?
Well, a recession in Europe would have some spillovers to us. I think we shouldn't exaggerate how significant they would be, but I do think this winter is going to be tough and challenging for our European neighbors.
And Nancy joins me now with more from the White House. Nancy, Secretary Yellen admitted quite candidly last June that she was wrong about inflation, that it's worse than she thought. Economists were wrong about the August report. So how sure is the secretary or anybody else over at the White House that they have an idea of what's really going on with inflation or the economy more broadly?
I don't think they are sure, John, and that's why in our interview she was very careful not to make any kind of prediction about when inflation would peak, how long it would take to recede, because she doesn't want to get into another situation like she did at the beginning of this crisis when she said that inflation was likely going to be transitory and later had to acknowledge that it wasn't. Time and time again, economists in the administration and more broadly have been caught by surprise. I mean, just think about a month ago when you heard so much talk about the fact that possibly inflation had already peaked and we were on our way back down. And now we get this new CPI report that is really confounding for a lot of people who study these numbers. They had assumed that once gas prices really started to recede significantly, that the prices for all these other goods and services that Americans purchase would start to follow suit. That hasn't happened. In fact, in the past month, prices went up again. And so now it's anyone's guess what the CPI report will look like next month.
Right. So if you can't get the diagnosis, it's hard to know what the cure is. Let me ask you, she's a former chairman of the Federal Reserve. Tuesday's inflation numbers suggested to a lot of Fed experts that the so-called soft landing, the idea that the Fed can get on top of inflation in a way that doesn't crumple the economy, that's going to be a lot harder, which means probably lots of layoffs and a dismal-looking jobs picture. So does Yellen share that view that pain is inevitable, as the current Fed chairman suggested? And if so, what are they doing about that?
Well, she said repeatedly that she trusts the Fed, that she believes in the moves that the Fed is making. She didn't want to get too involved when talking about the Fed because, as you pointed out, she used to run it, and the administration always tries to keep a healthy distance from what the Fed is doing. They don't want to look like they're meddling. But there's no question that now that this latest inflation report has come out, the Fed is likely to raise interest rates by another 0.75% next week, and possibly even more. And that may not be the end of it. And every time the Fed has to get involved, you increase the chances that jobs will be lost as interest rates go up. And but, you know, the reality is that at this point, the Fed is just much more concerned about high prices than it is about the labor market.
Right.
The labor market is strong, even though wages have not gone up in a way that would keep pace with inflation in this country. So even as people are finding new jobs and maybe making a little more, at the end of the day, they have less money.
That's
because
right.
everything costs so much more.
Let me ask you a question about money, actual money. You asked the Treasury Secretary about the delayed and mysteriously taking a very long time effort to get Harriet Tubman's image on the $20 bill. What did she tell you?
Well, she said that she is still working to make it happen. This is something that she said her predecessor was not interested in, and so the plan kind of fell by the wayside during the Trump administration. But she says that things are moving ahead to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, the first American woman to be on U.S. currency. Now, she said it's going to take at least a couple of years because every time you print new money, you've got to put new measures in place to discourage counterfeiters. And she even suggested that it's not set in stone because a successor, if they were to come along, let's say President Biden were to be defeated in 2024, a successor might decide they don't want to go that route. So that suggested to me that it's going to take at least a couple of years to turn this into a reality, though she did point out, John, that this winter, for the first time, there will be 2 female signatures on U.S. currency, hers and the new U.S. Treasurer, who was just sworn in, who is a woman as well.
Some progress, at least in that front. Nancy Cordes at the White House, thank you.
You're welcome.